Building guitar necks, part 3. Start by marking your nut location off the center line of your guitar. I'm just using a piece of metal that I know is square. Use a pencil with a very fine tip. Accuracy counts in this case. Then mark the fret slot locations across the length of your entire neck. I'm using a special ruler that shows the location of each fret across the entire scale of the guitar. Both sides are marked on either end for different scale lengths. I'm using a 25.5-inch scale length for 22 frets. When you're done, go over your marks with a scalpel. And this is what you should end up with when you're done. Then, from those marks that you made on the center line, extend them out to the edges using the same piece of metal. You could use a square, you could use anything. Mark them with a pencil, then score them with your scalpel. This cuts the grain and makes it easier for your saw to follow when you're just starting the cut. Then cut the fret slots. I'm using a fret slotting saw, and that green piece of tape is a depth stop. That should stop it when the cut is just barely deeper than the depth of the tang on the fret wire. Start slow with forward cuts and then gradually work back and forth. And you're going to do this for every fret. Then radius the fretboard. I'm using a sanding block that has a 12-inch radius cut into it. And I cut a piece of sandpaper and glued it to that and stuck it on the bottom to obtain that radius. From there, mark the inlay locations. I'm using dots, and I'm going to locate them in the center of the frets. I'm simply drawing an X connecting the corners of the fret slots, and this should give you a location dead center of that fret. Then drill the inlay holes. I'm using a 1/4-inch Forstner bit. Use whatever bit is appropriate for what your inlays will be. And be very careful not to drill too deep as you'll go into your truss rod. Then cut your inlay material. I'm using 1/4-inch OD aluminum tubing, using files to deburr as I go, and cutting them out with a hacksaw. I'm cutting them to a depth where they should be just proud of the fretboard after I install them. After each cut, I deburr the ends. And I'm going slow and trying to make sure I end up with an edge as close to square as I can after each cut. You do not have to be exact at this point. When you're done, apply a small dab of water-thin superglue inside the hole. Place your inlay into it and hammer it in. They're light taps. You're not trying to hammer a nail or anything. Just be gentle and do just enough to where you fully seat your inlay material. I'm using just enough glue to coat the bottom of that hole. Do this for all your holes. and then trim them flush to the fretboard. I'm using a flat file to take these down just to the height of the fretboard. You want to be careful as to not remove any material from your fretboard, but don't be too concerned because you can always sand it back later to make sure everything fits. I'm putting some masking tape on either side of that just to be careful that I don't mark up my fretboard. And repeat this step for all your inlays. I decided I want to fill the center with copper, so I'm taking a 2-part clear slow setting epoxy, putting part 1, the epoxy itself, into a small mixing container. Then I'm emptying some copper filings into the epoxy and mixing it up as best as I can. And afterwards I'll install the hardener to it and mix it up. My mixing stick is just a wooden skewer that I sharpen to a fine point. And this epoxy has a 20-minute working time. You can use a quicker set if you'd like. I just like the opportunity afforded by these slower setting epoxies. I'm wetting the tip and just carefully dripping it into the center hole of each of those inlays. You don't have to be too careful because we will be removing this material later, but you don't want to get it everywhere because you're just making more work for yourself in the future. After it sets for a day, go back and trim that flush to the fingerboard. I'm using a chisel at first just to take away the material, doing very shallow cuts, and then coming back after with a file, and then after that I will go over it with sandpaper. Don't be too afraid of marking up your fingerboard because it is not sanded to its final finish at this stage. I'm only applying light pressure with my thumb to the chisel, so I don't have to worry about it slipping and cutting my hand. Hold the chisel flat as you go, and you'll make sure that you don't scrape up your fingerboard. Next, throughout the headstock, I wanted to put my signature, so I signed it with a permanent marker, and then with a Dremel and a very fine routing bit, went along my signature to cut the trough. Next, we'll do the same thing with the epoxy and the filler. This time I'm using a purple dyed mica. And then I'll add the hardener and carefully drip it in. You do not want to use super glue for this. The epoxy is non-reactive. Super glue, if you add a fine particulate like wood shavings, metal filings, mica, will have a strong exothermic reaction, and you'll notice that the mixing cup will start to smoke and melt. I learned that from experience. The epoxy itself does have an exothermic reaction, but not as strong, but you do want to be careful with the cup. With the same stick, I'm just carefully dripping that epoxy and filler material into my wrap. After letting that dry for about an hour, I went and started drilling holes for the side dots. The epoxy is not yet cured, but it's at a state where I don't have to worry about it dripping or about fine particulates sticking to the top. I'm going to repeat the exact same process, this time using aluminum oxide. The aluminum oxide should match the ring of aluminum on my fret dot inlays. And the purple mica should match the purple of the fingerboard, as it is Purple Heart, a naturally purple wood. After letting the epoxy cure, I trim it flush with a chisel. These are again very shallow cuts, very close to parallel with the headstock, so I don't mark up the wood. And afterwards I will go over it with some sandpaper. The purple will be much more vibrant in the end. That's just some wood dust covering it. And repeat the same steps for each of these side dot markers. You could use any material you want for this. I like the epoxy resin inlay filling, as it's very easy to do and very forgiving. And when you're done, you should end up with something like this. In the next part, we'll cover installing the fret wire and cutting the nut.